At a small anti-war protest outside the White House, a disillusioned ex-senator, Mike Gravel, says, "I met Obama and felt arrogance with a touch of cynicism which overwhelmed his intelligence. He's into power." Chris Hedges would accuse him of using the veneer of intellectualism to support the dirty politics of Bush. And on catching sight of the US president's limo, a crowd chants, "Hey, Obama, hey, how many kids did you kill today?" It was a grim gear change from the delirium that had greeted his election, upon which he exulted. This was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow, and when he'd announce, to ecstatic gasps of joy, our planet began to heal. Shortly after, Obama prepared for a climate summit in Copenhagen, upon which the rest of the world would be pinning its hopes. The president spoke loftily of the US having charted our course, then declared assertively that the time for talk is over. But while the US commands more than its fair share of media oxygen, and thus overuses the atmospheric commons, 1 million a year die from US pollution, uncompensated, with more due from the countries who mimic its lifestyle. Yet, as Obama was unable to make any promises to reduce pollution, his contribution meant the rich nations stayed in charge, since, thanks to carbon trading, they'd just pay for their emissions, so the doomsday machine could rumble on unrestrained. At the Danish conference, the president penciled in just $1.47 for each citizen of the poorest countries affected, enabling them to be compensated with the price of a coffee, although this promise of the US wouldn't be binding. 77 underdeveloped countries, the victims of drought, of tornadoes, and random flash floods, were offered $10 billion in bribes so their petrol-head slave masters could continue pressing their feet on the gas. Lumumba Stanislaus Dieping, the negotiator from Sudan, said the accord spelled incineration for Africa. He compared it to sending 6 million people into furnaces in the Nazi Holocaust in the Second World War. The Venezuelan delegate, Claudia Salerno Caldera, said the deal was a coup d'etat against the authority of the UN. She even held up a bleeding hand, having slashed at her palm, to draw attention to the suffering she saw ahead. The rich, industrialized countries have the potential to change the destiny of the world, but today they're telling us that it's too expensive and won't let their economies be impacted. The leader of Tuvalu, a tiny island threatened by inundation, said he could not accept the agreement. "We're being offered 30 pieces of silver to betray our people, Mr. President. Our future is not for sale." I've a dread feeling we're on the Titanic and sinking fast, but we can't launch any lifeboats, as someone's decided that we're not sinking and need consultations to decide whether we're sinking or not. Lumumba Dieping claimed that there was no real deal. What has happened confirms our suspicions that a deal would be imposed by United States government on all the other nations of the world. Lumumba commented that the 10 billion offered won't buy developing countries enough coffins. Perhaps they'll economize on size, since children will die first, there being more vulnerable to famine and malaria. The Bangladeshi delegate said, "To my people at home, President Barack Obama was a god. But now that it's business as usual for the rich countries, they can see Obama as a human being." Overconsumption would continue unconstrained, so as to satisfy the demands of US citizens, equal, on average, to that of 123,000 Bangladeshis, casualties of the God-given American dream. President Mohammed Nasheed of the Maldive Islands warns, "You can't cut a deal with Mother Nature." He accuses President Obama of blatant obstruction. The islands are vanishing thanks to the US. Incredibly, the US burns more oil than the total consumption of China, Japan, Russia, Germany, India, and Brazil. but no alpha male's daily engorgement of 20 million barrels should entitle it to commit serial genocide. And by the US letting its carbon-trading gamblers make limitless sums, while those such opportunism starves are left with crumbs, the White House surely comes close to attaining that spiritual doom which Martin Luther King had so prophetically foreseen, a doom whereby the world's commons, its coral reefs and glaciers, the sea ice and the Amazon rainforest, can continue to be stolen from the poor and the most vulnerable, to be ground up by the jaws of Mammon. For US carbon trading merely salves the conscience of the wealthy through their share dealing in a specious right to pollute, a Wall Street scam whereby rich states can keep themselves afloat by shelling out $1, then shrugging as smaller states sink. Fidel Castro mocked President Obama's visit to the summit as a devious and cynical show. It's already evident a catastrophe threatens our species, yet the poor will shoulder the burden. And the worst, Castro reiterated, is the blind selfishness of a rich and privileged minority, which intends to impose the bulk of the necessary sacrifices on the immense majority of planet inhabitants. For the chiefs of empire, the moment of truth's arriving. Their own allies believe them less and less. Obama knows the grave danger that threatens everyone, but he's weakened by his own oligarchy. Evo Morales, the indigenous president of Bolivia, takes the platform and points out the US spent $687 billion for defense and for climate change, to save life, to save humanity. They only put up $10 billion. This is shameful. For centuries, our black and indigenous brothers were treated as slaves, and none of their rights were recognized. Now, our Mother Earth is being treated as if she was a thing without life. But denying the earth her rights will end all our lives. To an audience understanding the stark warnings, said Joss Garman, of experienced scientific minds, it was nothing less than the worst instincts of our species articulated by the most powerful men who ever lived. To Naomi Klein, the deal rammed through was a grubby pact between the world's biggest emitters. I'll pretend that you are doing something about climate change if you pretend that I am too. Deal? Deal. Karl Pope of the Sierra Club added, the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world is simply broken. A lot of Americans may have believed that Barack Obama is really different. I think it's turned out that he isn't. Hugo Chavez concluded, if the climate were one of the biggest banks, the rich governments would have bailed it out. Then, by an odd irony, the US president had to leave Denmark early, for his flight was threatened by a weather change. After he'd left, Morales said, we have to spend money to save lives, not to kill. The best thing would be if war spending went on climate change, instead of on troops in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or on military bases in Latin America. It could deal with the damage created by the US. Later, asked by Amy Goodman, you call the war in Afghanistan terrorist? Are you saying President Obama is a terrorist? President Morales said, if you send people in uniform to kill outside your own country, that, he said pointedly, is state terrorism.